of you are already, at least a couple people are working on projects where you're doing narrative analysis, or you think narrative analysis would be helpful to what you're doing. So I don't know that I hope that you'll bring up examples from your work if that seems appropriate as we have discussions, and then we can kind of address some of your issues. But we may not have time to get to everybody's individual project. I don't think we will. So feel free to talk to me. Hopefully I'll get to seminar earlier than I did today, either before or after, and if you have a project that you'd like to talk about with me, I'm certainly willing to do that, like in the afternoons following the workshop. So just grab me and we'll try and do that. So we do have a bit of time to, first of all, I want to hear if there are responses or questions based on today's reading. And I picked that one. We've just written it. We're still waiting for page proofs to come. It's going to go in a book about methods. And I thought it was probably a good overview, plus it gave you a little taste of some not so complicated narrative analysis, and just wanted to see if you had questions you wanted to raise about that. You don't have to, but I wanted to give you time to do that.
I have a question about, after you do the, like with the PAULS program, after you did the narrative analysis, what, I guess like what next? You know, did you use what you found in the narrative analysis to then talk with PAULS, or is the main objective to get this narrative analysis out, or, you know, what comes after?
Okay, so this is, I can only answer this incompletely because it's not my project.
Right.
It's Jill Yamasaki's project, and it's one that she did with her students at the University of Houston. They're actually going to get several pieces for publication out of it. I mean, what you saw was a tiny little excerpt. But the reason she picked that is that she's she loves dogs, as do I, and she's heavily involved with animal rescue groups, and I think she will continue working with the PAUSE project out of her own love for it. So probably both things as far as Jill is concerned. But it is being very fruitful in terms of what she's turning out for publication with it. And one thing that I would say parenthetically to that, and it goes for any kind of research that you do, and I teach about qualitative research in a more general kind of way. Narrative is one part of that. To the degree that you can pick something that you love for your research. Sometimes we pick things out of expediency, and I've done that. I've been on grants with other people where I don't love what I'm doing, but to the degree that you can do what Jill did and pick something that is a passion for you, go ahead and do that.
I think maybe the larger question is, how do you practically apply narrative analysis? Like, can you give us an example of something that you've done where you've been able to take your findings and, you know, and then say, well, this is a new way of thinking about it, or who would you be talking to? How would you be using your narrative analysis?
I guess I use it all the time. I've been involved with a lot of grants, sometimes, well, both with, probably more often with people in medicine, but also in public health. And they've picked me in those cases because I bring a different kind of methodological and kind of analytical way of thinking. And surprisingly, because this was not the case before, I'm not saying that there's a lot of people getting big NIH grants out there doing purely narrative analysis. That's not the case. But forms of qualitative analysis, including narrative, are being increasingly used. And when I talk about these grants, these are big team things where there's a lot of people working on a project. One thing, it's hard for me to separate the narrative from other kinds of qualitative work that I've done, but one thing that has been frustrating to me, but also I feel like I've made headway, at least with some people, is, so I've been brought in as a qualitative researcher to work on these big funded projects. But the understanding of what qualitative research does has been very, I don't want to use the word shallow, but it's very small. The understanding of people that are used to doing big studies. And most of those are, some have been surveys, some of them have been interventional studies. And so they see the qualitative work as maybe a way of starting out and doing some needs analysis. So if they're developing a big survey, we'll do a little bit of qualitative research, and that helps us generate items for the survey. But they didn't see qualitative work as an end in itself. And so I guess I've taken that on as a mission in some of these situations to say, yes, it can inform the quantitative work, but there's a lot of value in just this part here. And we've spent a lot of time doing that because it's time and labor intensive. And I think some of them have got it, some of them haven't got it. The other thing I would say about narrative work is that people can understand it. It's understandable because you are talking about stories. And it can get esoteric, some narrative pieces, but I think there is a logic there that is appealing to people and that they can follow. And in that sense, I think it makes for very useful reporting of your research. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. I think, most people, definitely the formative analysis, but I mean, is there a practice that has changed? Is there policy that has changed? Is there, mostly it seems like, a new type of understanding from what you're doing? People understand things differently, maybe.
I think it depends on the researcher and what they want to do. So with photo voice methodology, that was developed to help to get to policymakers.
Right.
And I haven't used it in that way, but other people have. And again, the idea is you have something really interesting that tells a story that policymakers can get. I shouldn't say I haven't done that. It hasn't been my main focus. But I do have a piece that's in Health Affairs, which is one of the major policy journals in the U.S. And it came out of my research with how breast cancer is being communicated publicly. I did, that particular piece is about how breast cancer stories affected lawmakers. whether in their own family or from their constituencies that they represent, and it did. So some of the big increases in breast cancer funding in the US that occurred in the mid to late 90s into the early 2000s, I don't know what's going to happen to it now with the budget cuts, was because of individual stories that made an impact on legislators in some way, including Bill Clinton and his mom, who died from breast cancer. So, yes, I think that can definitely happen. Other questions about the reading? Daniel?
Yeah, my interest in narrative theory is because it allows people to articulate an alternative form of rationality, another way of being.
Yes, yes.
I mean, like in this case where pets come into healing, I mean, that's not something you would consider normally in like a biomedical paradigm.
Mm-hmm.
I was just wondering, and especially looking at the questions in the table,
Mm-hmm.
whether you could comment and elaborate upon how narrative theory connects with critical theory, because I can see quite a critical slant to it. You know, like
What's omitted, for example.
what's omitted, what's privileged.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, could you perhaps talk a little about that?
Again, I think it's the sensibility of the person doing the narrative analysis. And I think they kind of meld and overlap, or they can. That question of what's marginalized or what is omitted from the narrative, I think I don't call myself a critical scholar, but that's something that's always on my mind, because it has to do with, it may have to do with marginalization, it may have to do with what is taboo, and people feel that they can't voice it. There may be many reasons for that, some of which you would expect a critical theorist or a critical scholar to identify. Some of that isn't because of marginalization, it's because there are things going on in health and medicine that are, you know, whether they have to do with sex or death, or parts of the body where people are reluctant to voice that. So there may be many reasons for why something is omitted. So some of those are an awareness of marginalization. But to me, the more important question is what isn't being said, and then we'll try and find the answers for why it's not being said. So there is overlap. Some narrative scholars think critically, and that's fine. You can bring that critical edge to it, but not all do. Yeah.
My question comes as being an ethnographer in a field, thrown into a different environment, culturally, politically, or economically. You find that frequently you are faced with so many difficulties of recognizing what is what.
Yes.
And then in the end, if I'm going to use this method, then what is the storyline that I need to choose? And then what are the things that I need to exclude to recognize it as not part of the storyline?
Yeah.
I mean, so I guess here is the inclusion and the exclusion.
But isn't that the case if for any kind of ethnographic work you would do? I don't know that narrative is different in that sense. But I think, ethnography is a form of interpretive work, and narrative is one subset of that. And that's always the case about how am I gonna what am I going to include or exclude, what's important, what isn't. And my answer for that would be the same for any form of interpretive research, which is your data is your evidence, right?
Mhm.
That's what you have to rely on. And you build your interpretation, you make your case, you make your argument based as well as you can on your evidence or your data. And I think, you know, one of the realizations about interpretive research is different people will make different interpretations, but we judge the goodness of your case based on how well you've used your evidence and made it persuasive.
Maybe.
1 second. If I could harken back to the talk I gave last week about Gina, the woman with diabetes, and there was the gentleman in the audience from psychology who, you know, wanted to raise the issue of, well, why didn't you get into issues of whether it was type 1 or type 2 diabetes, and, you know, it's her family, the problem is they're not taking insulin, it's not the diet, and all those things are true about diabetes, but that wasn't in my body of data. The way that woman identified herself, and I didn't ask the question Jeff suggested about asking her to identify herself, but I think she did. She said, I'm a young woman, 34 years old woman with diabetes. I come from this family in Louisiana. Louisiana was really important to her, and we eat and drink all the wrong things, and I have a hard time controlling it. That's how she identified herself. She didn't say a word about insulin. I don't know if she was getting it or she wasn't. I don't know if she was diagnosed as type 1 or type 2. That's kind of an extraneous framework that somebody could bring in to their interpretation, but my data had to do with her story, and that's what she told me, and that's what I used. So there's no law that said you can't bring in, you know, other kinds of that you couldn't read her chart or talk to her doctor or whatever, but then it would become a different piece of research.
Yeah, you know, this doctor that was there before, I think when you're in biomedicine, you're trained to know the story, and the story of diabetes is that there is type 1, type 2, and type 3. You know, what you're talking about are multiple stories. And for me, the part where, you know, what Kong is saying about, and also Daniel about critical and narrative, is when you say it's a process of co-construction, you know, so we're not very used to hearing the researcher say that she is part of the story.
Right.
You know, and from a critical point of view, saying, okay, you know, I'm a white Jewish woman or I'm an Asian American man or whatever, then helps the reader to say, okay, this is one story told from the prism of this person is part of the story, so that, you know, everybody does that when you know, the boy next door, the girl next door comes from a different culture, you know what I mean? So everybody's co-constructing.
Yeah.
Seems to me.
And so to get back to Kong's question, I think this happens in ethnography or any kind of interpretive research. You have the evidence that you've collected from your field notes, from your participant. They've been run through your mind. The interpreter is the instrument, right? And I think it's always, positionality is in there. Who am I in relation to what I'm studying? And I need to account for that too. I think I'm gonna, I did have a PowerPoint today to talk about Walter Fisher, and you might have looked at that, but, and I think it's important that we talk about Walt Fisher, but I want to make sure we have enough time to do this, to do the film. So I think I may hold off on that PowerPoint and I'll get to it tomorrow. So as we watch the film today, this is going to be your first exercise in doing analysis. And it's not that I'm expecting everybody to be a film critic or a film theorist. We're not using film theory. But I prepared a worksheet for you to think about some things. And then there is that detailed set of questions in today's reading. So, and there's the readings that you'll do tomorrow, including what Rita Sharon says she teaches people in terms of doing a close reading. There's another article that I wrote with, or actually it was a handbook chapter with Marcia Vanderford about what functions health or illness narratives serve. So you have a lot of different things already on day one that you can pick from. And my question that I'm throwing out to you and that I would like for us to discuss first thing tomorrow is, clearly this film that we're watching is a narrative of some sort, and I'm going to ask you to tell me what sort of narrative it is. Beyond, and I say that because it's telling a story, it has a plot, it has characters, and it has many of the other elements of narrative, and you can tell me which ones rose to the surface for you as you watched it. And by the way, I will say the plot may be obvious, but it's not necessarily quite so straightforward. And I want you to pay particular attention to the ending of the film because things get a little murkier there. So we are forced to do interpretation if we're going to say what kind of narrative this is. And you'll have to think about on what basis you're making that judgment. But mainly I want to know how this works as a narrative, okay? And including how it makes you feel as the receiver of this narrative.